I I have really enjoyed my past opportunities to speak to the American Sugarcane League. You all have been so generous with inviting me there, and it's been such a treat for me to make so many friendships and to enjoy your company and to enjoy your cuisine. So this is maybe my last American Sugarcane League annual meeting, but it's my first one without tasting any etouffee. So I hope I'll be able to make up for that sometime in the not too distant future. So what I'm going to talk today about, Jim and Jack thought it would be worthwhile to go through industry status and prospects and kind of take a look at where I'm leaving you at this point. What we have is a number of reasons for optimism. We do face some challenges going forward. We've got to defend U.S. sugar policy, and but I think we've got a really good uh, status for the industry right now. We're looking at a stable market with stable prices. I think that's one of our fondest desires in Washington and working on your policy is to provide some stability and some certainty going forward. God knows farming is difficult enough with dealing with the weather and other uncertainties. So it's good if we can provide you a stable horizon for your prices. As Jim Simone mentioned, the 2018 Farm Bill is in place through 2023, and it's a good farm bill. Solid sugar provisions in there. We're able to fight off efforts to harm sugar policy, and I think we've got a solid policy going forward. And as Jim also mentioned, the suspension agreements, the things that Jack Pettis and I and the other Washington reps have worried the most about over the last decade or two have been the trade agreements that various administrations have done that always seem to want to give away more of our market to foreign producers. And the NAFTA and the free trade with Mexico that began in 2008 was certainly a major one. But now, at least for the time being, that concern has been dealt with. So let's take a closer look at what's happening in the market with supply, demand, and balance and decent prices. We've actually seen production gain a bit. We've seen a strong recovery from the absolute disaster that we faced in 2013-14 from Mexican dumping. I think we've got a positive price outlook for the next few years, and focusing, boring it a little bit more on the price situation. What we economists look at is the stocks to use ratio. That's the amount of sugar basically left over at the end of a year, divided by the amount of consumption that we would have in the country. And the lower the stocks to use ratio, the better the prices. So the market's a little bit tighter. And the USDA has set its target price range to keep prices strong enough to avoid loan forfeitures at 13.5 to 15.5%. And over the last 20, 25 years, they've had some success in achieving stocks to use ratios within that range, but not always. And during the period from 96 to 2015, you can see here that the stocks to use average actually above their range at 16.2%, which has made it's put pressure on our prices. It's made it tougher for us. But because of the suspension agreements, I'll talk about more in a little bit, the USDA really has much better control over the market now. I think they've become increasingly accurate in their WASDE forecasts, and we see stocks to use ratios averaging the last several years over 14.5%. So right within that range, and that's a big major plus for our market. So this is the number 16 raw cane price over the last 25 years, and these are monthly averages. And what you have here on this horizontal bar is the forfeiture level. That's the price that USDA needs to defend in the marketplace to keep this a no-cost program, so that you'll be able to pay back your loans with interest. And you can see that there have been quite a number of years when the prices have been below that. We had the price spike associated with world sugar prices being a 30-year high. And of course, the disaster of the Mexican dumping, and then are fighting our way back from that since that time. And I think what is very significant, if you look at this over time, I put in a trend line here, and I would argue this is a major plus for our growers to see prices rising like this over time. If you consider in the 1980s, 1990s, the 2000s, over those 3 decades, nominal prices were the same. They're about 22 cents per pound. And of course, our real prices were eroding because of inflation. But now here we are moving into a new period here where we've got prices, raw prices in the 26 to 28 cent range to 29 cents at times. And so this is a real positive, and it gives our industry the opportunity not only to survive, but to make the investments that we need to stay viable in the future. You all have talked so much, and it's wonderful to see the wonderful Louisiana cane variety researchers honored today. And it's work like theirs that really enables us to have coped over the years with declining real prices, but also to be able to take advantage of the somewhat stronger prices we're seeing now. Now, of course, the Louisiana industry, to its credit, has vertically integrated considerably over the last few years. So the refined price is important to you as well. And here we have a similar situation where the trend in refined prices has been up steadily over the years. Just look at the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. We had refined prices only around 27, 28 cents per pound. Now here we are pretty steadily, pretty reliably in the 35, 36 cent range. So this is a real plus for both the beet side of the industry selling into the refined market and the cane side of the industry that's also selling into this refined market. So these are real pluses for our industry. Looking at the overall supply-demand situation, fortunately, consumption has been rising faster than production. This has been good for our pricing. Has been good for to see strong demand for sugar. And as long as consumption is rising faster than production, we're importing more sugar, but there is also more opportunity for our producers to expand if they can and provide more sugar to American consumers. Here's a closer look at what's happening with U.S. sugar production broken down by beet versus cane. And you can see, of course, there's a lot of variabilities. Farming is challenging. A lot of variability related to weather year after year. We're all keenly aware of the disastrous beet crop last year. Louisiana had a tough crop last year, but this is farming. Look at the bounce back that we're seeing for beet sugar, the bounce back that we're seeing for cane sugar. The resilience of farmers has always amazed me, and I admire that so much. Here's a closer look at cane sugar production by state. And of course, the variations in the case of both Florida and Louisiana have a lot to do with exposure to hurricanes, sometimes drought, a lot of variability. But I think the Louisianans can be very proud that they have been able, I inserted a trend line here, to move up. And that's been a combination of expanding area, albeit into even more sensitive areas because of the danger of freezes. But you all have developed the cane varieties that can deal with not only with pests, but with increased freeze dangers. And so it's a great credit to the industry. And I think another reason to feel good about where this industry is going when you see that we've been able to increase production over time, though we've closed many cane and beet mills. So turning to Mexico, this is what we have been most worried about is the NAFTA provisions with regard to sugar from Mexico. So this chart goes back to the beginning of the NAFTA, 1994, and these bars represent U.S. Sugar imports from Mexico. And during the first 15 years of the NAFTA, imports from Mexico were still highly restricted. But then that suddenly changed. January 1st, 2008, it was free trade with Mexico. And that's when really we began kind of holding our breath that while we do need sugar each year, we import about a fourth of all our consumption. And it's fine if some of that comes from Mexico. But the first few years after 2008, we kind of got away with the fact that Mexico didn't have any really great crops. The U.S. didn't have any really great crops. We needed the sugar from Mexico, and things were going along with some stability. But then in 2013, things got really bad really fast because Mexico had a huge crop, and that coincided with one of the biggest U.S. crops ever. So we needed less sugar from Mexico, but they sent us more. We needed less than 1 million tons from Mexico, but they solved their surplus problem by sending us more than 2 million tons, twice as much sugar as we needed. They were able to do that through subsidies and dumping, that is selling below their cost of production. And so it kept the Mexican market very strong and destroyed the U.S. market. So we sued, and the U.S. government found that Mexico was subsidizing and dumping to the tune of 80% margins. In other words, tariffs that would have gone into place to compensate for that would have been over 80%. It would have halted trade with Mexico completely. But what the U.S. and Mexican governments did instead was negotiate suspension agreements, that is to suspend those tariffs, not to put them in place immediately. And they came up with a very rational solution, and that was to limit Mexican access to the U.S. market to U.S. import needs. What a novel idea. And what that did was restore for USDA their ability to balance supply and demand and to avoid taxpayer cost. It also, a really key provision for us was that it raised the so-called reference prices. So that's the price below which Mexico could not sell to the U.S. market as a way to try to minimize Mexican dumping into our market. So what we've seen then since the suspension agreements went in place in 2014 is a much more rational situation where we've got imports from Mexico still quite substantial. They're still by far our biggest single supplier of sugar, but the amount of sugar they're sending us is consistent with the amount of sugar that we need. Now let's look at what happened on the price side, going back to this raw cane price with the monthly averages over the last 25 years. So you have down here the forfeiture level price floor that the Farm Bill gives us. But then this is the suspension agreement price floor, which is considerably higher. Instead of 22 cents per pound, we're looking at 25 to 26 cents per pound. So if the U.S. price drops below these reference levels, then Mexico cannot send into the U.S. market. It becomes self-correcting. If we are not getting any more sugar from Mexico, the price will come up to reflect that. And so this is how now we've moved into really, I think, a brave new world for minimum sugar prices in the U.S. And the same goes for refined sugar, which has a higher reference price. And that's essentially given us a price floor around 33 to 34 cents. And we're seeing the market behave accordingly with prices quoted for much of this year around 36, 37 cents per pound. So this is a huge benefit going forward and a greatly increased level of certainty for our market. Turning to the challenges that we face, Jack Pettis talked about the high turnover rate in Congress. Jack calculated that 33% of House members and 22% of senators have never voted on sugar policy. So we always have a huge educational process in front of us. And Jim and Jack talked about the fly-ins, and gosh, we just appreciate so much your coming into town to help us with that education process. Another challenge we face, we've got some great champions in Congress. Colin Peterson of Minnesota shockingly lost his race in Minnesota. He had been the chairman of the Ag Committee. Mike Conaway of Texas had been the ranking member, but he chose to retire. So we'll be looking at working with new chairpersons of the committees of the House and Senate, but we are optimistic that we can get their support. The Farm Bill, of course, what we've always faced, in addition to concerns about trade, are attacks by our beloved customers, the sweetener users, the food and candy manufacturers are constantly attacking us, and they're claiming that sugar prices are too high, that they're double the world price, and it makes it hard for them to survive. But in fact, you've heard me make this argument many times, and will continue to make this. The world price is really meaningless. That our actual wholesale prices are lower than other developed countries, not higher, and that sugar really is not a deciding factor in whether sweetener user company profits are substantial or not. So you've probably seen me make this argument before. I'll make it for you one last time. You'll probably hear Rob Johansson make this argument in the future. But as we try to explain why it's unfair to compare U.S. prices to the world dump market, this is, I think, a pretty good way of illustrating that. So what this line represents is the world average cost of producing sugar. It's been about 19 cents over the last 30 years. So you would think if you pictured world sugar prices, you expect them to be higher than the cost of production, right? At or above the cost of production, because that is how an industry could stay in business. But of course, the reality is that the world dump market has averaged much lower than that, averaged about only 13 cents per pound over this 3-decade period. And let's keep in mind that that world market is where only about 20-25% of sugar is sold. The bulk of our sugar, the world sugar, is sold at wholesale prices within the country where it's produced that are much higher. So let's take a look at that. So here's the refined dump market price over the last 30 years. I'm sorry, this is International Sugar Organization average over the last 10 years, about 22 cents per pound. Now, the world average wholesale price, that's where about 80% of sugar is sold, is much higher than that, almost 40% higher than the world dump market price. So this 30 cents per pound, that's where most of the sugar is being sold, not at this 22-cent dump price. So where does the U.S. figure in? Where our wholesale price is somewhat higher than the world average, but our wholesale price is below the developed country average. In other words, the candy manufacturers in other developed countries are paying more for their sugar than we are. So U.S. consumers and food manufacturers are getting a good deal on the sugar that we provide them. Another way that we try to illustrate how distorted the world market is to describe to Congress and to the administration how foreign countries subsidize their producers very generously. And so this information, we don't come by that readily. We've gotten experts around the world to do studies for us on Brazil, on the European Union, on Mexico, on Australia, on India, on Thailand, to try to show how heavily they interfere with their markets. And that would be crazy for us to unilaterally disarm and just be overwhelmed with dumped foreign sugar because of these foreign subsidies. The other argument that I just want to address quickly that the sweetener users make is that, gosh, they just can't be profitable when sugar is so expensive. But we've done some study right within the ASA. We've done quite a bit of work on this over the years and looked at the amount of sugar in retail products and essentially multiplied that amount by the cost of sugar to come up with a percent of that cost accounted for by the cost of sugar. And this surprised even me when you consider products like Skittles or Lifesavers that you think of as just being sugar and flavoring, that still the sugar in that product constitutes 3 to 5% of the cost of that product. Another way of looking at this is to track candy bar prices over the decades. And back in the mid 80s, a candy bar costs about 35 cents. And we calculate that the sugar in that costs about 1 to 3 cents. We move on to the present time. A candy bar costs $1.49, And darn if the cost of sugar is still only about 1 to 3 cents for that candy bar. So when the sweetener users try to get candy or sugar prices down, it's not to benefit consumers. It's not to sell more candy bars. It's to increase their profits. That's an opportunity for them. When sugar prices drop, you'll find candy bar prices will stay the same or go up, and user profits rise as a result. Turning to our trade challenges, I just touched on this before. We've got uh, the concern that every time a foreign country does a trade agreement with the U.S., that they want to try to get, particularly developing countries, they want to get more access for their sugar into the U.S. market at the expense of our growers. But here's another bonus of the suspension agreements I hadn't even mentioned before, but the way that the governments of the U.S. and Mexico wrote those, any future import concessions that we make will reduce Mexico's access to the U.S. market, not American producers. So those suspension agreements are important to us in that regard, but monitoring what's going on in trade is important too. We've got to remain vigilant. We've got a wonderful veteran of USDA and USTR, Brian Grunenfelder, working with ASA now, who is monitoring this for us. He succeeded Don Phillips, who many of you might have known as our former trade consultant. And Brian is focused now on negotiations underway with the United Kingdom, with the European Union, Japan, Kenya, and other threats that may come down the line. So we've got to keep an eye on that. The other big challenge to our future is the threats to U.S. sugar consumption and the unfortunate misguided attacks on sugar, that there's a tendency to look at rising obesity in this country and just come up with a simple solution. Well, just let's eat less sugar. But the reality is that we're eating more food. Our caloric consumption is up about 20% over the last few decades. Probably our physical activity is down. And maybe that's the reason for obesity increases. Meanwhile, the sweetener share of our caloric consumption has been falling. So what we want to insist on is that federal guidelines that they be based on manufacturers' reformulation efforts, based that on science. Greg Gravois talked about how we dodged this bullet, that the federal dietary guidelines say limit our sugar consumption to 10% of total calories. They were thinking about going down to 6%, but fortunately, we're able to fend off that change. Let's take a little more closer look at what's happening with per capita sugar consumption and HFCS, high fructose corn syrup consumption. You can see here per capita consumption dropped dramatically during the 80s when our soft drink industry converted to HFCS. Things kind of leveled off for a while. And then in the early 2000s, we began to see a turnaround as per capita sugar consumption began rising steadily. HFCS consumption went down. That was largely the switch from soft drinks to water. But we're very happy to see year after year rises in per capita consumption until just the last couple of years. And here we've seen the last 3 years that per capita sugar consumption actually dropped a bit. So this is alarming for us. Now, the 2020 numbers aren't in yet, but surprisingly enough, even with the pandemic, we get the impression that per capita sugar consumption probably went up in 2020. People were consuming less at restaurants and events, but they were consuming more at home. God bless them. So per capita sugar consumption should be coming up a bit. Meanwhile, total sweetener consumption, so this is sugar plus HFCS, has been down considerably. It's just amazing to me that we would get blamed for the obesity problem when per capita sweetener consumption has been dropping by about 20% over the last decade, over the last 2 decades. Let's take a closer look at what's been happening with obesity, and this is certainly alarming that we've seen this a tremendous drop a tremendous rise in obesity as a percent of the population. We've seen a tripling or quadrupling of child and adult obesity rates. And there's a tendency, you have people saying, well, what role did sugar play in this? I'm sorry, I'm ahead of myself here. What role did sugar play? And this is where we can see that sugar consumption actually has dropped over that time. Even if you build in HFCS, you can see caloric sweetener consumption has dropped. So there's obviously no correlation here whatsoever, and that's an education job that we've got to continue to pursue. So let's make sure that they follow science, defend sugar consumption going forward. We've got a tremendous team working on that. Dr. Courtney Gain at the Sugar Association is a noted scientist. She's got a lot of credibility in the world of health, nutrition, and sports. And the American Sugarcane League has been a very strong supporter. Jim Simone has been a president of the Sugar Association in recent years, and I hope you'll continue to support that effort going forward. So, in conclusion, we've got a lot of reasons to be optimistic. The 2018 Farm Bill was a good one. We've got suspension agreements with Mexico that are solid. We've got the prospects for a stable sugar market for years to come. The challenges that we face are significant, but they are surmountable. I think with vigilance, we can defend sugar policy, we can defend sugar consumption, defend attacks on sugar policy, make sure the suspension agreements work well, and keep an eye on future trade negotiations. So I feel as though I'm leaving you in a good place, that there are reasons, the reasons for optimism outweigh the reasons for concern. I have to tell you, I wish I could be there to say it in person, but it's been the honor of my life to represent American sugar farmers these 31 years. I've had the gratification of working with such a dedicated and talented team in Washington, and to win these battles, working with the likes of Jack Pettis and Vicki Myers and Laura Gouge. I think that we've got a tremendous team there, working with our beat brethren. And again, I can't thank you enough for coming to Washington to help us with those efforts, to taking the time away from your farm and your family to come in and knock on doors on Capitol Hill. And I know you'll be doing it again this year, if only virtually. It's been a tremendous joy to make the friendships that I've made over time. I so appreciated the support that you've provided to our efforts in Washington. And I've been around long enough that, gosh, I get to work now with the sons and daughters of farmers and mill owners that I've worked with in the past. And it's thrilling to me to know that I got to play some small part in seeing this industry continue. Um, I To reiterate, it's tough to leave, but one of the things that makes it easier to leave is to know I'm leaving you in a good place. And I'm absolutely thrilled that I'm able to leave you in such good hands. When I found out that the chief economist of USDA, a brilliant guy who is so well respected throughout the U.S. industry, was interested in succeeding me in my job, my gosh, what greater compliment could I possibly have received than that? And we've got Rob on tap to speak to you today. We'll get to him. I just have a couple more slides, and we'll do a little Q&A if there's time before Rob speaks. But I'll just quickly go over his background. He's spent 21 years at USDA, the last 5 of which he was the chief economist, a critical role involved in all the policy work that USDA is responsible for. Prior to that, he had been 2 years with the Office of Management and Budget, 2 years with the Congressional Budget Office, a year with the Council of Economic Advisors. This is a brilliant guy, and also a really nice and pleasant guy, and I'm looking forward to your getting to know him. My next chance to see you, I hope, God willing, will be our symposium in Napa in August. We'll see what happens. I sure wish that we can get together there in what I consider the promised land, with my particular love for wine, but mainly I want to be able to see so many of the friends I've made in the industry over the years. I'm not gone yet. I've got another 5 months or so to be with the industry, And please don't hesitate to contact me if you need me. So I will back out of this now and ask if there are any questions that I might try to answer.
Jack, first, thank you for all of your years of service and everything that you've done for the industry. I did receive 2 questions, and I'll go ahead and fire those off while other people are typing theirs up in the chat or raising their hands. The first one is from Jim Simon. He asked, "What happens at the end of the current suspension agreements?"
Yeah, that's a great question. And the suspension agreements basically move in 5-year cycles. There is something called sunset review, which basically examines how the agreements are working. They look at how the stakeholders are concerned. So in our case, that would be the U.S. and Mexican governments, the U.S. and Mexican industries, and the buyers of sugar. And the first review took place in 2019 after the first 5 years of the suspension agreements, and they breezed through. The Mexican government raised no objection. Actually, no major parties raised any objection. So the fact is that they're working. So the next review is in 2024. And I've talked with our team of trade experts, the likes of Chuck Levy and Bob Cassidy, and lawyers are very cautious, but they believe that we will win the review in 2024. And they say as long as these continue to work well, and the U.S. and Mexican governments and industries are both happy with them, that they think they could remain in place indefinitely. That's not to say we won't look down the road to find other ways to codify those, perhaps into U.S. law. But I'm impressed at the level of optimism, even by our cautious trade lawyers, that the suspension agreements could stay in place indefinitely.
And second question I have here is, there has been some talk of sugar ethanol trade with Brazil. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm against it. What we're basically looking at there is that the U.S. Surprisingly enough, we do sell some ethanol in Brazil, and our U.S. Ethanol producers would like to sell more ethanol down there. By the same token, the Brazilian sugar exporters, who are the biggest exporters in the world, would like to sell more sugar into our market. Now, I'm all for U.S. Selling more ethanol into Brazil, but that should not be at the expense of U.S. producers. I don't think we need to make any further concessions. We're already the world's 3rd biggest importer of sugar overall. Brazil has the biggest chunk of that. Of overall world exports, by far, they have the 3rd biggest share of the U.S. market. So they already have excellent access to the U.S. market. And just parenthetically here, I will say that if somehow U.S. decides to grant Brazil a little more access for sugar into our market, that will come out of Mexico's share of our market and not the U.S. Now, that's not to say we could sit back and let that happen. I think we're going to argue very strongly that Brazil already has plenty of access to the U.S. market. But it's a valid concern. I'm glad Jim brought that up, and it's another one that we're going to be looking at very closely. Any other questions?
That's all the questions I've received so far from chat. Anybody else?
Okay, well, thank you all so much for having me. And gosh, I hope I get to see you again in Napa, if not sooner. And could we turn it over to Rob Johansson?
Great, thanks, Jack. Good afternoon, everyone. First, I want to thank Jack Roney for that kind introduction, and certainly a special thanks to Jim Simone and Jack Pettis for inviting me to join you virtually today and to introduce myself a little bit more. First, I want to say I'm extremely excited to be joining the American Sugar Alliance. I certainly look forward to working with all of you and hopefully visiting when travel returns to more normal conditions. Originally, I hail from Minnesota. My extended family still lives in and around the Twin Cities. But our roots range from Virginia up on the Iron Range to farms out west near Granite Falls. I grew up in the Twin Cities, but we did have some land north of Grand Rapids up near Canada, where I spent a good deal of my youth hunting and fishing. I did a lot of duck hunting then, and I always thought about trying to get some duck hunting in down south in Louisiana with you guys, where I heard it was a lot better. I left Minnesota for 2 years during high school. I spent a year in London and another year in New Zealand before attending Northwestern University in Chicago, where I studied economics. After college, I joined the Peace Corps. I worked with farmers in Central Africa as an extension agent between 1990 and 1995, building fish ponds and integrating livestock and crop farming activities with their fisheries operation. After Peace Corps, I came back to Minnesota to study agricultural economics and to complete my PhD before heading off to DC to work with USDA. As a quick side note, I did come down to LSU to interview for a position in their Ag Econ department as well at the time, and I'll share that story with you hopefully at a time later. At USDA, I've worked on farm policy, trade policy, and most recently, COVID relief policies. I had a big hand in the MFP programs, as well as the CFAP programs and the WIP programs of the past few years. Looking at this year's planting season, we'll likely see a different policy environment from before. Obviously, the global economic forecast does point to a recovery from the pandemic. Global GDP is expected to be a mirror from what it was in 2020. So we expect to see a growth of almost 4% instead of contracting by 4%. And same for US GDP, which is likely to move from a retraction last year of almost 6% to an expected growth of almost 4%. But the impact of COVID on the economy looks like it will persist until we do get the vaccinations distributed to everyone. Similarly, we know personal income for Americans was protected last year to a certain degree by the government stimulus programs. And we did see actual disposable income in the US rise last year by about 9%. However, we'll likely see disposable personal income fall in 2021. The extent will obviously depend on the current stimulus bill. Lower personal income will have implications for spending on food and groceries as the economy reopens and the balance between food purchases for home consumption rebalance with food purchased away from home. And similar to those economic conditions in the US and the world economy, the farm policy we've seen over the past couple of years is likely to see some pretty big changes as well heading into the new administration and certainly ramping up for the 2023 Farm Bill. We've seen a historic year of government programs, WIP, MFP, CFAP, on top of spending on other programs like ARC PLC and crop insurance. Government assistance to farms topped out at $46 billion last year, or about 11% of total value of ag production. That spending helped boost farm income in 2020, 43% year over year, despite the pandemic. We know crop and livestock receipts are actually expected to rise in 2021. Most recent FAPRI analysis shows an expected increase of almost 26 billion year over year. And that's up significantly from their August forecast. However, we also know that farm ad hoc programs will scale back. And the forecast right now is for overall net farm income, even with higher cash receipts, is expected to fall year over year by up to $20 billion. Now, the new stimulus funding will offset some of that decline, and we'll see if there are other programs developed by the new Congress and implemented by USDA. It's clear the new administration will be focused on climate change and sustainability, as we've heard about, with agriculture playing a large role. And I would expect a continuation of the previous agricultural innovation agenda focus with an attention to meeting the biofuels mandates and setting a course for 2022 and beyond for just overall farm policy. It's unclear how the new administration will utilize the Commodity Credit Corporation or the CCC spending authorities to mitigate natural disasters, trade, or other events, or perhaps to support something like a carbon bank. And it's unclear how the new Congress will view such spending. I've mentioned we have seen some indication of the willingness to continue to support ad hoc disaster in the stimulus or appropriations bills. And today, when Secretary Vilsack was testifying, he asked for increased flexibility to utilize that CCC borrowing authority to help incentivize farmers to adopt climate-friendly practices. But the questions still remain. For example, how will OMB view such spending? And these are just some of the reasons why I'm looking forward to working for the American Sugar Alliance and working with you all. I've enjoyed combining economics with farm policy and outlook, and I feel that working on sugar policy and beet cane production will allow me to focus my experience and training on a complicated commodity, one with ties to both new and old policy, one with ties to domestic and international markets, as Jack just showed, and a one that allows me to go more than surface detail on the policies and the production that we're seeing. So again, just thanks for the quick opportunity to say hello and introduce myself. I look forward to spending a lot more time together over the coming years as we prepare for the next Farm Bill. And I hope to also see you in Napa Valley this summer, and to salute Jack Roney for his excellent work for the industry. Goodbye for now, and I wish you have a record crop for 2021, and I hope I get down to see it. I'm going to turn it back to Jim Simone and Jack Pettis. And again, thanks again for welcoming me, and look forward to meeting you in person.